The German reconnaissance pilot banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109 over the English countryside 300 feet above Dover, squinting through morning fog at something that made his blood run cold. Tanks, hundreds of them. Sherman and M4s parked in perfect military precision across the fields of southeastern England. Artillery batteries positioned along the chalky cliffs, supply depots stretched for miles. He counted convoy after convoy, assembling near the ports, photographed everything his camera could capture, then pushed the throttle forward and raced back across the channel. The intelligence report landed on Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's desk within hours. Massive armored concentration near Calais. Patton's First Army Group, minimum 40,000 troops. But here's what that pilot didn't know. What von Rundstedt didn't know, what even most Allied commanders did. Every single one of those tanks was made of rubber and hot air. The greatest military deception in history wasn't being carried out by generals or spies. It was being executed by a traveling roadshow of artists, sound engineers, and set designers who'd just been handed the most dangerous acting job of World War II. Their stage? The battlefields of Europe. Their audience? The entire German high command. And if their performance failed, D-Day would become the bloodiest disaster in American military history. The impossible mission, January 20th, 1944, Camp Forest, Tennessee. Colonel Harry Reeder stood before 1,100 men who just received the strangest military briefing of the war. Many of them were artists, fashion designers, painters, architects, and sound technicians. Some had been plucked straight from New York advertising agencies and Hollywood studios. Others were radio operators with perfect Morse code mimicry. A handful were combat engineers who could build or fake just about anything. Gentlemen, Reeder began, his voice measured but urgent. You are now the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Your mission is to become a ghost. The 23rd wasn't training to invade Europe. They were training to lie about invading Europe and make those lies so convincing that German commanders would stake their entire defensive strategy on illusions. This was no ordinary deception unit. The 23rd combined 4 specialized components into one unprecedented weapon, but the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, 379 men armed with inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that could be set up faster than you could pitch a circus tent. Each dummy weighed just 65 pounds, not light enough for 2 men to carry, but from 500 yards away, or through the lens of a German reconnaissance camera, they looked identical to 30-ton Sherman tanks. The signal company's special 296 radio operators who could impersonate entire divisions. They'd studied the fist of real Army radio operators, the unique rhythm each man used when tapping out Morse code, like a signature that German radio interceptors had cataloged. These men could forge those signatures, creating phantom networks for armies that didn't exist. The 32 Signal Service Company, 145 men who specialized in sonic deception. They'd spent months at Pine Camp, New York, recording every sound a real armored division made. Tank treads grinding through mud, the metallic clank of hatch covers, sergeants shouting orders to button up for night operations, the distinctive diesel growl of M4 Shermans idling in formation. These recordings were played through custom-built speaker systems mounted on half-tracks. Each speaker array weighed 500 pounds and could project sound over 15 miles on a quiet night. And finally, the 406th Engineer Combat Company, 168 fighting soldiers led by Captain George Reb. While the illusionists staged their magic show, the 406th provided security and used bulldozers to carve fake tank tracks into the mud, because German aerial reconnaissance could spot a suspicious lack of vehicle tracks from 5,000 feet. But rubber tanks and sound effects weren't enough. The British had pioneered military deception in North Africa with Operation Bertram. Nothing attempted before had been mobile, multimedia, and designed to operate within artillery range of the enemy. The 23rd was the brainchild of 2 men who couldn't have been more different. Major Ralph Ingersoll, celebrity journalist and best-selling author. The New York Times once called him a prodigiously energetic egotist. Ingersoll had served in North Africa, then returned home to write The Battle is the Payoff, which rocketed up the bestseller lists. He was the kind of man who'd pitch wild, impossible ideas and somehow make people believe they could work. His partner was Colonel Billy Harris, West Point graduate, 3rd-generation Army officer, the man who'd eventually command Custer's old regiment. During the Korean War, Harris was the pragmatist, the officer who'd take Ingersoll's fever dreams and figure out how to actually build them. Together, they sold the top brass on an audacious concept, a tactical theater company that could impersonate any division in the European theater, move that illusion across hundreds of miles, and convince German intelligence they were facing forces 10 times larger than reality. Training was intense and strained. Artists learned to inflate 40-foot-long rubber tanks in under 5 minutes, camouflage them imperfectly enough to be spotted from the air, then deflate and pack them before dawn. Radio operators practiced not just mimicking other operators, but creating the organic chaos of a division-level command. The urgent traffic during an artillery barrage, the routine check-ins during a quiet sector, even the telltale silence when a unit moved out. The sonic crews faced perhaps the toughest challenge. Their half-tracks had to drive to within a few hundred meters of German lines, park in the darkness, then blast recordings of armored columns moving into attack positions. If German artillery spotted them, those 500-pound speakers would make excellent targets. If infantry patrols discovered the trick, the operators wouldn't have time to escape. By April, the Ghost Army was ready, but nobody, not even Rita, fully understood how dangerous their illusions would become, or how many lives would depend on whether German commanders believed in phantom divisions. May 1944, the Ghost Army arrived in England as D-Day preparations reached fever pitch. While most of the unit remained in staging areas, 17 men from the Ghost Army landed on Omaha Beach 8 days after D-Day, June 14th, with one objective: create dummy artillery positions visible enough to draw German counter-battery fire away from the real guns, hammering German positions. They succeeded. German shells rained down on inflatable howitzers while the real artillery battalions fired uninterrupted. But this was just the warm-up act. The true test came in August, when the Ghost Army received orders for Operation Brest. The French port city of Brest was under siege. German commander Hermann Bernhard Ramke had 38,000 troops dug into fortified positions, and he'd made it clear he'd fight to the last man. 3 American divisions, the 2nd, 8th, and 29th, encircled the city. General Omar Bradley and General George Patton both agreed, "We must take Brest. The U.S. Army cannot be beaten." The Ghost Army's mission: make the Germans think they were facing 5 additional tank battalions, draw their reserves to the flanks and trick Ramke into surrendering before more American boys had to storm those fortifications. August 21st, rain hammered down as the Ghost Army convoy rolled across Brittany. Sergeant Bob Tompkins of the 603rd drove a jeep completely exposed to the elements, water streaming down his face. He scribbled in his diary a violation of security regulations. "Oh, wait off, you son of a bitch. I feel like a frozen, drowned rat." They split into 3 task forces, X, Y, and Z. Task Force X, commanded by Captain Oscar Seal, drew the most dangerous assignment. 200 men had to convince the Germans that the 15th Tank Battalion was assembling just 2 kilometers from the front line, then moving into attack positions threatening the German right flank. On the morning of August 23rd, patrols reconnoitered the area near the hamlet of Curlin. The combat engineers discovered the wrecks of 15 half-tracks destroyed by German Panzerfausts, a grim reminder that this wasn't a training exercise. That afternoon, they set up 53 dummy tanks and several support vehicles. A light tank from the real 709th Tank Battalion laid down realistic tracks throughout the area, zigzagging around the inflatables, crushing grass and churning mud, creating the signature pattern of an armored unit digging in. Then came the sonic show, 10:30 p.m. 5 half-tracks equipped with wire recorders and oversized speakers crept to within 800 meters of German observation posts. The crewsmen, like 20-year-old Corporal Al Albrecht from Milwaukee, cranked up the volume and began their performance. The recording started with the sound of one tank, the diesel engine coughing to life, the squeal of treads biting into dirt, the metallic clank of hatches, then another tank, then another. The volume built gradually, realistically, until the night air thundered with the sounds of 18 tanks moving into position. They repeated the sequence twice more, simulating 3 full companies, 54 tanks arriving under cover of darkness. Captain Bill Patton, an observer from the 2nd Infantry Division, stood 2.5 miles away and wrote in his report, "Sound effects were extremely realistic. Shifting gears, tread noises, crackling of brush, voices of guides leading tanks into final positions could be clearly distinguished. Any interested observer would have been convinced that a large number of vehicles was assembled." At dawn on the 24th, the deception continued. Men lit cooking fires. They pitched tents with the 6th Armored Division markings clearly visible. Some even hung laundry on lines strung between the fake tanks, a touch of domestic normalcy that made the scene completely believable. Sergeant Tompkins looked southeast through his field glasses and saw German observers in the church tower at Guisnu, watching them. Perfect. But the Germans weren't just watching. They were responding. That night, August 24th, 10 p.m., Task Force X deflated their rubber tanks and moved forward to a new attack position at Lormeaux, 1 kilometer south. The sonic trucks followed, playing the sounds of armored companies advancing. Corporal Albrecht and his crew drove their half-track to within a few hundred meters of German lines. I remember looking out there, Albrecht recalled years later, and saying we're pretty close to the enemy. Private Phil Delisante described it as like being on the firing line. They cranked up the speakers again from 10:45 p.m. to 1:15 a.m. The sounds of tanks moving into attack positions echoed across no man's land. The German response was immediate and terrifying. Artillery shells began dropping on the fake tank positions. 22-year-old Corporal John Jarvie was sitting in his Jeep when he heard the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds. I thought, holy hell, I gotta get out of here. He tried to exit, but his gun belt caught on the steering wheel. Those 2 shells slammed into the ground at 50, 60 feet in front of my Jeep. Plunk, plunk. Dirt went up in the air, and no explosion. Pure luck. That was one of my 9 lives right there, but not everyone was lucky. The American attack kicked off at 1 p.m. on August 25th. Tompkins watched from the top of a hedgerow. Fireworks start. Artillery raising absolute chaos. Saw shells landing 400 yards in front of us. Could hear machine guns, rifles, mortars. Saw 4 thunderbolts strafing with rockets. They roared over our heads and dove into the thick of it. Havoc bombers came over. A couple of mortar shells came our way. Landed about 50 yards behind us. Whole front line is one screen of smoke. The deception had worked too well. Through a tragic miscommunication, Company D of the 709th Tank Battalion, the real tanks that had helped create the illusion, joined the attack from near where the Ghost Army had focused Germans' attention. The Germans had repositioned between 20 and 50 88mm anti-tank guns directly at that sector. The 709th tanks were obliterated instantly. 5 tanks destroyed before they even reached the line of departure. Those guys never had a chance, Jarvie remembered. They just got decimated. The Ghost Army men stood in stunned silence as smoke rose from the burning Sherman. This was the dark side of deception, when your illusion becomes someone else's. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson, the unit's operations officer, wrote grimly in his after-action report, "The tanks should not have attacked in that place, or otherwise the 23rd should have employed deception in another area. Coordination is everything." Meanwhile, Task Force Y, positioned near Lannion, 800 meters in front of the 37th Field Artillery Battalion, had a different role. Draw counter-battery fire away from the real guns. They weren't using inflatables. They'd built homemade flash canisters from spent shells that loaded with half a pint of black powder and an electric igniter. Whenever the real artillery fired, Task Force Y would detonate their canisters, creating muzzle flashes that mimicked a full battalion. German coastal guns opened up half an hour into the battle. Shells the size of a man's arm screamed overhead. Most landed just in front of the fake artillery position. Not a single shell fell on the real gun. The deception achieved one objective, drawing German reserves to the flanks. But Ramke refused to surrender. The siege dragged on for 27 more days. Operation Brest taught the Ghost Army 3 critical lessons. 1. Their illusions were convincing enough to redirect enemy artillery and reposition anti-tank guns. 2. Coordination between deception units and real combat forces was absolutely essential. Lives depended on it. 3. They were no longer playing theater. They were on the firing line, and German shells didn't distinguish between rubber tanks and real soldiers. Just beginning to realize how vulnerable we were. Tompkins wrote in his diary after pulling out, "Stories came in from various sources. We were lucky, but ready for what came next." September 15th, 1944, Saint-Germain, Calais, outside Paris. At noon, Colonel Reeder received an urgent message from General Walton Walker, 20th Corps. "Need deception unit at the Moselle River immediately. Patton's attacking Metz. We have a problem." The problem was this. More than 25 miles of the American front line was held by just 1 cavalry squadron, fewer than 800 men. If the Germans discovered how thinly stretched that sector was, they could punch through, circle behind Patton's Third Army, and turn the attack on Metz into a disaster. The Ghost Army had 4 hours to prepare. By 4 p.m., 500 men were rolling east toward Luxembourg, toward what would become their longest and most nerve-wracking performance, Operation Bedembourg. The mission: impersonate the 6th Armored Division's 8,000 soldiers and hold a 25-mile front with nothing but rubber, radios, and guns. They crossed into Luxembourg on September 16, only 5 days after liberation. Crowds lined the streets of Esch-sur-Alzette, cheering these American soldiers heading to the front, having no idea what was hidden under those canvas-covered trucks. The unit split into 2 combat commands. Combat Command A set up in the woods north of Abweiler, just inside the commune of Bettenburg. Combat Command Reserve established positions 2 miles away, near Reuser. By nightfall, A dozen inflatable Sherman tanks stood in the woods. At 6:30 p.m., a planning meeting. Then at 10 p.m., the sonic trucks began their concert, playing the sounds of an entire armored division moving into position. The cavalry colonel who commanded that sector came storming up to Lieutenant Dick Syracuse's security perimeter, carrying a Thompson submachine gun, grenades hanging from his flak jacket like Christmas ornaments. "What the hell is going on here, son?" "What do you mean, Colonel?" Syracuse replied carefully. "What are those tanks doing there?" Syracuse tried to explain that there were no actual tanks. "Don't tell me that. I know what I hear. There are tanks out there, and nobody told me there was going to be tanks here." The colonel had missed the briefing. His aide hadn't filled him in yet. After everything got straightened out, his parting words were, "Well, son, you certainly could have fooled me. If the deception fooled a battle-hardened cavalry colonel at close range, it would definitely fool German observers across the Moselle." The next morning, September 17th, the Ghost Army painted 6th Armored markings on every vehicle. Their factory section churned out fake shoulder patches that men sewed onto their uniform. Everyone memorized a short history of the 6th Armored so they could answer questions if approached. Then came the atmospheric deception, small human touches that made illusions real. Men were sent into Bettenburg and nearby towns on recreational leave. They hung out in cafes, spoke loudly about their division, complained about officers, swapped stories about the hedgerow fighting in Normandy, all in places where German spies or sympathetic civilians might overhear. A water point was established in sight of Bettenburg's town center. Trucks made repeated trips back and forth as if gathering water for 8,000 men. Guards from the 406 Combat Engineers dressed as military police from the 6th Armored stood at key intersections in Bettenburg and Leudelange, directing traffic that didn't exist, creating a sense of constant military movement. And the civilians noticed. Lieutenant Colonel Simonson wrote, "Civilians were observed photographing bumpers, taking notes, asking friendly questions. The original plan called for 2 days of deception, just long enough for the 83rd Infantry Division to arrive and plug the gap. But the 83rd was delayed. Day 3, Day 4, Day 5, every hour increased the risk. Every sunset brought German patrols closer. Every dawn meant another chance for reconnaissance flights to spot something wrong. A dummy tank that hadn't been properly camouflaged. A speaker truck, positioned where no tank should be." Lieutenant Bob Conrad summed up the mood. "There was nothing between us and the Germans but our hopes and prayers. German units were spotted moving to defensive positions across the river, defending against an armored division that didn't exist. Patrols probed the American lines. Shots echoed through the woods at night. Telephone wires laid by the signal company were found cut. On September 21st, Day 7, Sergeant Tompkins wrote in his diary, German patrol reported about 3 or 4 miles away. Civilians seem to be getting too anxious about our setup. We should have moved out a couple days ago, but attack seems imminent, so I guess we have orders to remain." Even General Patton felt the pressure. In a letter to his wife, he wrote without mentioning the Ghost Army directly, "There is one rather bad spot in my line, but I don't think the Germans know it. By tomorrow night, I will have it plugged. Colonel Polk is holding it now by the grace of God and a lot of guts." Colonel James Polk, commanding the 3rd Armored Cavalry from his headquarters at Chateau Bettange outside Thionville, wrote to his wife in equally guarded terms, "I have command of the most unusual army that has ever gotten together. I do wish I could tell you about it, as it is absolutely crazy." Finally, September 22nd, Day 8, the 83rd Infantry arrived. That night, the sonic trucks carefully played the sounds of tanks moving away, the Ghost Army slipping out in the darkness, maintaining the illusion until the last moment. The 83rd took over the line. Patton's flank held, the attack on Metz continued, and the Germans never realized that they'd been staring at rubber and hot air for over a week. An after-action report from the 3rd Cavalry gave credit where it was due. The establishment of a simulated armored division by the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops added to the bewilderment of the enemy as to our strength. All indications pointed to the fact that he thought we were in great strength in this sector. The Ghost Army had held the line with nothing but illusions and prevented what could have been a catastrophic breakthrough. But their most important mission was yet to come. March 1945. The war was entering its final phase. The Allies stood on the western bank of the Rhine River, the last major barrier between them and the heart of Germany. Crossing it would be one of the most dangerous operations of the war. German defenders had months to prepare fortifications, pre-sight artillery, and position reserves for counterattacks. 9th Army Commander Lieutenant General William Simpson planned to cross near Dusseldorf. But if the Germans knew exactly where and when the crossing would happen, they could concentrate overwhelming force at that and turn the Rhine into a bloodbath. Enter the Ghost Army. Operation Viersen would be their largest, most elaborate, and most important deception of the entire war. The plan makes the Germans believe that two full infantry divisions, the 30th and 79th, representing 40,000 troops, were assembling 10 miles south of the real crossing site, preparing to cross near Viersen. If it worked, German reserves would rush south, artillery would reposition, panzer units would redeploy, and when the Ninth Army actually crossed at Dusseldorf, they'd face minimal resistance. If it failed, thousands of American soldiers would cross that river into concentrated German fire. March 17th, the Ghost Army moved into position. 600 inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and support vehicles were set up in fields and forests south of the real crossing point. But this time, the Ghost Army didn't just inflate dummies. They choreographed a massive military buildup that German reconnaissance could photograph and German radio intelligence could intercept. The signal company created phantom radio networks for both divisions, transmitting routine traffic, simulated planning sessions, even fake logistical reports about bridging equipment being moved into position. The sonic trucks recorded new material specifically for this operation. The sounds of pontoon bridge construction, the metallic banging of engineers assembling floating spans, officers shouting commands about load capacities and current speeds. But the real genius was in the details. Division headquarters were established in commandeered buildings, complete with guard posts, radio antennas, and a constant flow of staff officers. Ghost Army men wearing the appropriate insignia, coming and going at all hours. Fake artillery positions were set up with flash canisters ready to simulate pre-crossing bombardments. Bulldozers carved deep vehicle tracks throughout the staging area. Laundry lines appeared outside tent clusters. Maintenance areas were staged with dummy vehicles in various states of repair, and the atmospheric deception reached new levels of sophistication. Ghost Army soldiers, now wearing 30th and 79th Division patches, flooded into nearby towns. They talked in bars about the river crossing. They asked locals about current speeds. They complained about how dangerous the operation would be. They discussed bridge assembly procedures loud enough to be overheard. Some even staged arguments about whether the crossing would happen at dawn or dusk, feeding contradictory information that made German intelligence work harder to figure out the truth. For 5 days, the Ghost Army maintained this massive illusion just miles from German observation post. German artillery responded. Shells fell on the dummy position. Proof the deception was working. Reconnaissance flights photographed the fake buildup. German radio intercepts recorded the Phantom Division's communication. On March 24th, the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine at Dusseldorf. They encountered light resistance. The casualty count for the crossing, 32 soldiers. Without the Ghost Army's deception, military analysts estimated casualties would have been between 12,000 and 17,000. Let that sink in. 32 casualties versus a potential 12,000 to 17,000. The Ghost Army didn't just fool the Germans. They saved thousands of American lives with inflatable tanks and recorded sounds. General Simpson sent a commendation to the 23rd. Your brilliant execution of Operation Viersen contributed directly to the success of the Ninth Army's Rhine crossing. The enemy committed significant reserves to defensive positions based on your deception. Outstanding performance. But the war wasn't quite over for the Ghost Army. They continued operations through April 1945, conducting smaller deceptions as Allied forces pushed into Germany. They staged phantom divisions to cover troop movements. They simulated buildups that never happened. They created chaos in German intelligence reports, making it impossible for enemy commanders to know where real threats existed. By May, Germany surrendered. The Ghost Army had conducted 21 battlefield deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They'd impersonated more than a dozen different divisions. They'd operated within artillery range of German positions, sometimes within rifle range. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were lost to enemy action. Dozens were wounded. And according to military estimates, their deception saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. But when they came home, they couldn't tell anyone what they'd done. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops returned to America as the war ended, carrying secrets they were forbidden to share. The military classified everything about the Ghost Army. The fake tanks were destroyed or buried. The sound recordings were locked in vaults. The after-action reports were stamped top secret and filed away. Why? The Army believed they might need to deploy similar deception units in future conflict. If potential enemies knew exactly how the illusions worked, the trick would never work again. So these men went home and said nothing. They became fashion designers. Bill Blass, who'd set up dummy tanks at Brest, became one of America's most famous designers. They became artists, painters, sculptors, illustrators who'd used their creative skills to wage war in the most unusual way imaginable. They became architects, advertising executives, teachers, businessmen. Some went to Hollywood, some went to Madison Avenue, some returned to small towns and quiet lives. And for 50 years, they kept the secret. Occasionally, a newspaper article would slip through, mentioning something about special deception units or unusual tactic, but the full story remained classified until 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended. When the documents finally came to light, historians were stunned. Military analysts called it one of the most successful tactical deception operations in military history. The Ghost Army had influenced the outcome of D-Day, held critical sectors of Patton's line, and turned what should have been a bloodbath at the Rhine into a relatively unopposed crossing. In 2022, 78 years after they first deployed the United States, Congress finally awarded the Ghost Army its highest civilian honor, the Congressional Gold Medal. Only 7 members of the original 1,100 were still alive to receive it. Bernie Bluestein, who'd operated sonic equipment and painted fake unit markings on trucks, said at the ceremony, "We were just doing our jobs, but I'm glad people finally know what we did." The Ghost Army proved something remarkable. The creativity and deception could be as powerful as firepower and armor, that artists and engineers could fight just as effectively as infantry and tanks, that sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that causes the most destruction, but the one that prevents it entirely. Today, military deception remains a critical component of modern warfare. The principles pioneered by the Ghost Army: multimedia, coordination, atmospheric deception, technical sophistication are taught at military academies worldwide. But no unit has ever quite matched what those 1,100 men accomplished in Europe from 1944 to 1945. They created phantom armies. They staged elaborate theater for an audience that wanted them gone. They operated in constant danger, knowing that if German patrols discovered their inflatable or captured their sonic equipment, the illusion would collapse and real soldiers would face the consequences. They saved thousands of lives with rubber tanks that weighed 65 pounds and speaker trucks that played recorded sounds. The Germans laughed when they first heard rumors about Allied forces using dummy equipment. They called it desperate, amateurish. Cardboard tanks deployed by armies running out a real one. But the Ghost Army had the last laugh. Because when D-Day came, German reserves were positioned at Calais, waiting for Patton's Phantom First Army Group that would never arrive. When Patton attacked Metz, German forces defended against armored divisions that existed only as inflation valves and sound effects. And when the Ninth Army crossed the Rhine, the Germans were ready for an attack that was happening 10 miles south of where it actually occurred. The greatest lie ever told on a battlefield wasn't spoken, it was staged. And to this day, somewhere in the archives, those original sound recordings still exist. The sounds of Sherman tanks that never rolled, artillery that never fired, and an army that existed only as illusion, but changed the course of history. The Ghost Army proved that in war, as in theater, the most important thing isn't whether something is real. It's whether the audience believes it's real. And in 1944 and 45, the German High Command believed. That belief cost them the war and saved tens of thousands of American lives. The men who made them believe were artists with day jobs as soldiers or soldiers with day jobs as artists. Either way, they painted victory with rubber tanks and recorded sounds and wrote themselves into history as the most unusual combat unit ever deployed by the United States Army, the Ghost Army. Heroes who fought with illusions and won with lies that told the greatest truth of all, that creativity, courage, and imagination can change the world.